A forest garden is a layered system of trees, shrubs, perennials and ground covers designed and planted to maximise beneficial species interactions and minimise competitive effects, with the aim of growing a wide diversity of crops, mainly edible plants, but it could be plants for all sorts of other uses, including medicinal plants, and also with the aim of achieving a very low input system, low energy input that is, and good output. Another way to think of a forest garden is as a diversified orchard. So in other words, you start off with your orchard trees, mostly fruit trees of course, and then you start to diversify. You underplant. Downwards you diversify with shrubs and ground covers and perennial crops. And then occasionally you also overplant. In other words, between the trees and above the trees will tower the occasional higher tree, certainly if your system has space. Here, an Italian alder just behind the apple tree. So forest gardens have a very long history in the world. At least 14,000 years from Southeast Asia, probably much longer. In fact, when humans just interacted with forests, they would turn them into forest gardens. They would cut some trees, they would encourage others, they would probably plant the seeds of others, particular fruit trees they wanted or whatever. And you'd gradually turn a natural forest, if there is such a thing, into a forest garden. There's a process of kind of co-evolution. But that history is mostly from the subtropics and the tropics. In the northern hemisphere, forest gardens have a much shorter history, about 40 years in Western Europe and North America. But one of the things in these climates, of course, is we're further north, we're further from the equator, the sun doesn't get as high, we have to be much more careful with how much sun we let through to be able to grow plants between and underneath trees. So tree spacing is critically important here. And of course, you can't put trees together so closely here as you could in the tropics because there just won't be enough light underneath them to be able to grow a big diversity of plants. Another critical feature of forest gardens is that they're a layered system. There are layers of trees, from high trees if your system's big enough, smaller trees, shrubs, perennials and ground covering plants down low. So the resources, the aerial resources, the soil resources, they're all used very efficiently, much more efficiently than a single crop can ever do. Another key feature is diversity. Diversity is so important. That is how you get a resilient system, having a lot of different species in it. In this garden there are several hundred. In most forest gardens there are at least 100, probably more, which compared with a monoculture is vastly different. That diversity is one way we're mimicking nature. We're mimicking the diversity of nature, or sometimes even increasing the diversity you find in nature to make a very resilient system, resilient against pests, resilient against diseases, and resilient against whatever the climate throws at it. And of course, in an era of climate change, what is damaging plants, and will do so increasingly, is not the gradual increase in temperatures, but the increase in weather extremes. It's the floods, it's the droughts, etc., that damage plants. And systems based on perennial plants and based on diversity are much more resilient. Another key feature of a forest garden is minimal soil cultivation. The soil is basically covered all year, if possible, certainly most of the year, by living plants, ground covers, perennial crops and so on. You have to remember that annuals are very rare in nature, and actually basing our agriculture on annual plants is in many ways very unnatural. Annual plants are not very sustainable. They're weak, they're susceptible to drought, they're susceptible to floods. Perennial plants are much more resilient. They have bigger root systems, they're more stable, and they can cope with climate variations in a way that annual plants can't. there are system plants. System plants are there to help the system function. They may not be crops for you at all. So comfrey, for example, here is a fantastic bee plant. It's very important to keep your bees happy and your pollinators happy. It's also a very good mineral accumulator, making minerals available in time to other plants. Ponds attract lots of wildlife that will catch your pests. So by having a diverse system and things like a pond and system plants to attract beneficial insects, you won't get any insect pests. Forest gardens are very low input systems. The input is mainly human labour. They're complex systems. They're not suitable for machine harvesting. There are fruits. Most people have fruit trees and fruit bushes in their forest gardens. That can include all the common fruits like pears here, but it can have lots of uncommon fruits as well. There are lots of different kinds of fruit trees from all over the world with interesting and tasty fruits. There are nut crops, things like sweet chestnut here, fantastically productive carbohydrate crops on trees. There are also things like walnuts and hazelnuts, oily nuts with very, very healthy oils in them. Probably much healthier for us to eat a lot of them than a lot of carbohydrate. There are seed crops you can grow. This is Bladdernut, an understory tree from mainland Europe, very easy to grow in the shade beneath other trees and shrubs in a forest garden. There are lots of tuber crops and tuberous vegetables, root vegetables you can grow that are perennial in this system. This one is a perennial type of nasturtium called Mashua that actually is here for the edible tubers, big edible white tubers from South America, where it's a commercial crop there. The leaves also edible as a vegetable. There are salad vegetables, for example, lime leaves from pollarded lime trees instead of something like a lettuce. There are herbs. Herbs not only to eat, but also to make the forest garden a lovely place to be in, with all their aromas. And also, a lot of herbs are very good system plants as well. Herbs like the sweet cicely you can see here in the foreground and the peppermint behind it are extremely good at attracting beneficial insects as well as being nice plants to eat. So within a system function role, they're very important in a forest garden too. There are spice crops. This is Szechuan pepper, and there are a number of spices you can grow on trees and shrubs. Some of them very high value as well as an economic crop. Mushrooms are another fantastic crop, very suitable for growing in a forest garden. These are my shiitake mushroom logs here, oak logs inoculated with shiitake fungus, and they are incredibly productive producing mushrooms. There can be industrial products like pine resin from pine trees, for example. Pine resin is a mixture of complex hydrocarbons and is incredibly useful stuff. It's usually distilled to make turpentine and rosin. Those are the two products from distillation. And then those are used in industry to make a load of other things. There are crops to grow for poles, canes, bamboos, for example, are a fantastic crop for forest gardens. Not only do you get the canes to use or sell, but also you get edible bamboo shoots through the spring as a perennial vegetable. You can also grow fuel wood, coppice for firewood, for example, or indeed you might coppice or pollard to produce logs to grow mushrooms on. You might have plants for tying or fibre use, like this New Zealand flax, whose leaves are incredibly strong. And you can split into lengths and then use for tying. You can tie knots with it, all sorts of garden tying jobs only need biodegradable twine, and this is perfect. There are lots of environmental benefits from forest gardens. They sustain a fantastic range of wildlife. Invertebrate levels can be very, very high. They sequester a lot of carbon as well into the woody mass of the plants, and also sequestering into soil and increasing soil carbon levels, which is a huge issue. Forest gardens are aesthetically beautiful places. They often have a semi-wild feel to them, even though they're cultivated. It does feel as though you're working with nature and are close to nature by being in it, much more so than in a field of grass or a field of wheat. Forest gardens are very efficient systems of production. By efficiency, I'm talking mainly about energy efficiency. You have to remember, annual crops take a huge amount of energy to grow. And that's because the further your system is away from woodland, the more energy you have to put in to maintain it. And digging the soil, cultivating the soil, takes a huge amount of energy. And in the long term, without oil, is it even possible? I don't know. So can forest gardens be commercial? That's a tricky question. Forest gardens, as you've seen, they're complex systems. They have lots of different plants. They have plants mixed together. Nothing's in lines. These are all things that from a commercial point of view are not good. Commercial systems for making money like to be very simple. One crop, maybe two. Straight lines make harvesting efficient. There's nothing like that in here. So how do you reconcile those two things? Only really by increasing the value that is paid for food, increasing the value that society pays for environmentally sustainable growing systems. That's really the only way it can happen.